There's a certain kind of man who doesn't beg. He doesn't send long, emotional paragraphs. He doesn't ask if you got home safe. He doesn't chase connection at the cost of himself. And because of that, the world labels him cold. But Spinoza would have called him something else. Free. Now take a moment. Be honest with yourself. How many times have you loved someone more than your dignity allowed? How many times have you buried your own instincts, silenced your better judgment, just to keep a woman interested? How many times did you answer her text after she ignored yours, stayed when she pulled away, wept when you should have walked? You called that love. It wasn't love. It was emotional slavery dressed in romance and rose-colored illusion. Spinoza saw you. Even before you existed, he saw the man ruled by his own passions. And he warned you. He wrote, "An emotion which is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it." In other words, the moment you understand your feelings, they stop controlling you. But you didn't try to understand them, did you? You let them drive. You let them speak for you, cry for you, act for you. You let them define you. She didn't walk away because you were stoic. She left because you were unstable. She didn't lose interest because you were distant. She lost interest because your emotions were on display, available on demand, cheap. You worshipped her. You treated her attention like oxygen, and you mistook your addiction for devotion. Spinoza's philosophy was war against that illusion. He didn't say emotions are evil. He said if they rule you, they'll destroy you. And right now, you're the proof. You live at the mercy of your moods. You fall in love too quickly. You explain yourself too often. You're scared to be misunderstood. And that's why women don't trust you to lead, because you can't even lead yourself. The emotionless man? He isn't heartless. He's disciplined. His silence isn't weakness. It's self-control. His detachment isn't trauma. It's structure. He doesn't react. He responds. He watches. He calculates. He sees her chaos and chooses not to step into it. He sees her distance and doesn't panic. He sees her beauty and does not kneel. He has mastered what Spinoza called the freedom of the wise. The ability to feel without being enslaved by what you feel. You don't need more sensitivity. You need strength. You don't need to open up more. You need to close the door to everything that makes you betray yourself. Because the emotionless man isn't a myth. He exists, and he's feared. Not because he hurts others, but because he cannot be hurt by what destroys most men. Their desperate need to be loved. You were told to be emotional. Spinoza says, be exact. Because the modern game of affection, it's not about love. It's about attention. And if you want to survive it, you'd better learn to stand like that man. Still, calm, unmoved, untouchable. You think she left because you didn't say enough? Because you didn't feel enough? No, brother. She left because you felt too much, too loudly, too easily. You made your emotions cheap. You made yourself easy to manipulate. You gave her everything. But in doing so, you gave her nothing of value. Here's something Spinoza knew with frightening clarity. Anything that can be moved by another is not free. And you, emotional, vulnerable, eager to prove you're not like other men, you were moved by everything. A look, a text, a delay, a mood swing. She held your dignity hostage with a single unread message. And the worst part? And then you called that love. The emotionless man doesn't flinch. Not because he doesn't feel, but because his feelings answer to him, not to her. Spinoza didn't hate emotion. That's where most men get it wrong. What he hated, what he warned against, was passivity, being acted upon. That's what separates the emotionless man from the emotional addict. He feels, yes, but he chooses when, where, and how. He doesn't fall into chaos. He studies it. He doesn't explode in anger, because anger is just sadness in armor. He doesn't collapse in grief, because grief is ego in mourning. He doesn't confuse obsession for loyalty, because he knows to worship another human being is to insult the divine within yourself. That is Spinoza's dark gift, the realization that most of our suffering isn't love. It's just unexamined weakness. You think heartbreak makes you deep? It doesn't. It just proves you invested your identity into someone who could leave. Here's the cruel irony. Women aren't repelled by your lack of emotion. They're repelled by your inability to master it. The emotionless man doesn't apologize for being distant. He's not trying to prove his worth with access. He doesn't overshare. He doesn't write novels in the DMs. He doesn't ask, what are we? He doesn't beg for clarity, because he is clarity. His life isn't a negotiation. It's a principle. And principles don't argue. He doesn't fear loneliness, because solitude isn't a punishment to him. It's a monastery. It's his forge, his battlefield. Most men crumble in silence. He builds in it. Most men chase validation. He guards his energy like sacred fire. Most men wait to be chosen. He chooses himself. Every single time. You've been trained to believe that emotional availability is strength. But let me tell you what's truly broken. A man with no boundaries. A man who teaches women that love means total surrender. A man who has no compass except the temperature of her mood. And what's strong? A man who cannot be moved unless he chooses to move. That is the emotionless man. The one Spinoza would call wise. Not because he feels less, but because he knows the exact cost of every feeling and refuses to bleed where it isn't sacred. Let's stop pretending. Most of your emotional wounds didn't come from being too tough or too cold. They came from the belief that giving more would eventually earn you love. You thought your availability was value. You thought emotional exposure made you honest. You believed that if you felt deeply enough, you'd become irreplaceable. But you were wrong. Spinoza wouldn't pity your heartbreak. He wouldn't romanticize your suffering. He would diagnose it. He would say, you weren't betrayed by her. You were betrayed by your own misunderstanding of emotions. You thought emotion was proof of connection. Spinoza said, it's more often a symptom of confusion. And until you gain clarity, until you bring order to your internal world, you're not in love, you're in bondage. You feel like you're being brave by loving without limits, but you're just handing over your power, your peace, your identity to someone who hasn't earned it. Every time you opened up out of fear, every time you gave your entire soul to keep someone from walking away, that wasn't courage, that was conquest, and you were the one being conquered. Spinoza saw emotion as a force, a raw force. And like any force, if misunderstood, it destroys. That's why the emotionless man isn't numb. He's not broken. He's aware. He doesn't run from emotion. He masters it. He doesn't need to tell the world he's in control. You feel it the moment he walks into a room. His stillness isn't emptiness. It's a sign of how much chaos he's already burned away. That's the difference. You react, he decides. You spiral, he studies. You collapse, he holds. When she pulls back, you chase. When she withdraws, he stays grounded. You crumble under silence. He builds in it. You live for connection. He lives in command. Spinoza once wrote, anger is just sadness with armor. Grief is just ego in mourning. He wasn't saying don't feel. He was saying, understand what you're feeling before you let it run your life. But you never asked those questions, did you? You just let it all bleed out, unfiltered, unexamined. You called her your goddess. You made your pain into poetry. You called your obsession love. And deep down, you thought suffering made you noble. But it didn't. It just made you easy to break. Because she could say one thing, delay one reply, and your whole emotional state would fall apart. The emotionless man, he doesn't operate like that. He doesn't flinch at silence. He doesn't beg for attention. He doesn't chase meaning in people who haven't shown they can carry it. He doesn't explode. He exits. He doesn't argue. He observes. He doesn't perform. He preserves. And most importantly, he doesn't plead, because he knows anyone who can trigger you owns you. Let that sink in. How many people have had keys to your nervous system? How many people could ruin your day with a single look, a single change in tone? You think strength is lifting weights? Posting? No. Real strength is this. Who owns your peace? Spinoza's darkest revelation wasn't just that emotion can destroy you. It's that most men secretly want to be destroyed. Because the pain feels like purpose. The chaos feels like connection. The heartbreak feels like depth. You stay where you're disrespected. You chase where you're devalued. You wait to be chosen. Because deep down, the suffering makes you feel alive. And that is what keeps you weak. Spinoza would tell you that's not love, that's addiction. And the only cure for addiction is clarity. So let me give it to you straight. A woman cannot respect a man who's ruled by his emotions. She cannot trust a man who's more moved by her mood swings than by his own mission. And she will never surrender to a man who treats her attention like salvation. That's why she ghosted you. That's why she rolled her eyes when you poured out your soul. That's why she gravitated toward the man who said less, but carried more presence. Because she saw something in you. You were still a boy, asking to be seen. Still looking for approval like a lost child. That's not attraction, that's vulnerability without wisdom. You don't become the emotionless man by turning off your heart. You become him by putting your heart under your command, by becoming the kind of man who can love without losing himself. The kind of man who can stand in the storm and still stay centered. The man who can say, even if she leaves, I remain. That's what Spinoza meant when he said, the wise man is guided by reason, not fortune. But most men, they live at the mercy of fortune, the mercy of affection, timing, chemistry, attention. They are emotionally outsourced. Every part of their identity is up for negotiation if she just gives enough validation. But the emotionless man, he's self-sourced. He lives by design, not by reaction, and that terrifies people. Because in a world built to feed on your emotional instability, your reactivity, your neediness, your hunger, a calm, detached man is dangerous. He can't be baited. He can't be sold lies. He doesn't buy guilt. He doesn't chase closure. He walks away from manipulation, not because he's bitter, but because he values his peace too much to auction it off. And when she calls him heartless, he doesn't argue. He just smiles. Not because he's proud of being distant, but because he's finally protecting the one thing most men never protect, their soul. She says he's changed, that he's not the same man. And she's right, he's not, because now he doesn't try to win love through pain. He doesn't treat emotional collapse as romantic effort. He doesn't throw himself at the feet of someone who never saw his value. He's tasted something rare, emotional independence. He doesn't need affection to validate his worth. He doesn't need someone else's desire to prove he's a man. And that's what makes him untouchable. Not because he feels less, but because he finally... Spinoza never said, don't feel. What he said was far more terrifying. Feel wisely. Feel without being owned. Feel in a way that brings order, not destruction. That's the lesson no one ever taught you. Because from childhood, you were trained to believe your value came from how much you feel, not how deeply you understand. So you became easy to manipulate. You mistook emotional chaos for meaning. You turned your soul into a public diary thinking it made you brave. But Spinoza's ethics was a map out of that trap. He wrote, the more you strive to live according to the guidance of reason, the more free you are from the emotions which are passions, and the more you become the cause of your own emotions. Did you catch that? The cause of your emotions, not her, not your childhood, not your trauma, not your triggers, you. That's the birth of the emotionless man. He doesn't seek validation. He doesn't perform kindness hoping for intimacy. He doesn't open up out of fear that silence means rejection. He opens up when it's earned, when it's safe, when he decides, because he understands the cost of exposing his soul, and he's no longer willing to throw it at the feet of someone just because she smiled twice and liked his story. He's not boastful about being detached. He doesn't need to be. His energy says everything. He speaks calmly, listens clearly, and walks away from emotional bait like a surgeon cutting out disease. He doesn't explode. He exits. He doesn't plead. He pauses. Because he knows, if someone can trigger you, they can control you. And that's the truth most men never face. You've been owned. Most of your life. By a glance, a text, a tone shift, you thought that was love. It wasn't. That was dependence. And dependence is where your dignity goes to die. But here's the truth. You can change. Right now. Because if Spinoza taught us anything, it's that power doesn't come from avoiding feelings. It comes from understanding them. That's the path of the emotionless man. He isn't bitter. He's clean. He isn't numb. He's composed. He doesn't run from love. He just refuses to let love turn him into someone he can't respect. You were told to be in touch with your feelings, but no one taught you how to govern them. So you live like a man with his skin turned inside out. bleeding on everyone, hoping someone would call it love. That ends now. Because the emotionless man is not empty, he's precise. He doesn't confuse emotional intensity with depth. He doesn't mistake heartbreak for heroism. He remembers what his unchecked feelings did to him, how they made him beg, how they made him break, how they made him betray himself, and he said, never again. That's Spinoza's final and most terrifying revelation, that the man who masters his emotions becomes untouchable, not because he doesn't care, but because he refuses to be owned. You hear that? You've been owned by the fear of being left, by the thrill of being desired. You weren't loving. You were leaking, bleeding energy into women who didn't even ask to hold it, and every drop of attention felt like water to a drowning man. But the emotionless man, he's not thirsty, he's not desperate, he's not starving for someone to see him, because he feeds on something no one else can give him, self-command. He studies his reactions, he sharpens his logic. He doesn't just feel, he directs what he feels. He loves when he chooses to love, not when he's afraid of being alone. He knows feelings aren't facts, that sex isn't intimacy, that attention isn't connection. He doesn't call his ex a goddess. He doesn't romanticize pain. He doesn't immortalize someone who left him. He moves with clarity. He holds his power with both hands. He has what Spinoza called the intellectual love of God. Not in a religious sense, but in the understanding that peace doesn't come from a woman, or a reply, or a perfect moment. It comes from within, from reason, from the inner structure of a man who's seen the fire and chose not to burn. And you can become that. You can stop reacting to every silence. You can stop fearing her distance. You can stop searching for yourself in her eyes, because you were not born to be emotionally unstable, reactive, soft, or small. You were born to stand, to see through the game, to reclaim your center, to become the man Spinoza whispered about in every cold, rational sentence. The man who feels and remains unshaken. So now it's your choice. Will you keep over-explaining yourself to people who don't understand your soul? Will you keep giving your peace away to women who can't even manage their own? Will you keep mistaking emotional exposure for strength while your dignity dies quietly in the corner? Or will you rise? Not with noise, not with drama, but with the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who needs nothing. Because he understands everything. This is your moment, not to feel more, but to feel better, to shut out the noise, to sit in your stillness, to become the man who doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't panic, the man who doesn't bleed for attention, the man who chooses his emotion like a weapon, not a weakness. If this spoke to something deep in you, like the video, share it with another man who's been lost in the noise, and subscribe to the channel. Support the mission in the description below. Because the world doesn't need more emotional noise. It needs men who are clear, calm, and finally, free.